Welcome to the Social Engineer Podcast, the Doctor is In series. This is episode 253. I'm Chris Hedeggy, CEO and founder of Social Engineer LLC, the Innocent Lives Foundation, and the Institute for Social Engineering, and hosting this podcast since 2009. And as always, since the Doctor is In series, and I am not one of those, we actually have two doctors with us today. But let me introduce our co-host and co-panelist, Dr. Abbie Maroño. Nice to have you here.
Good to be here, Chris. I'm Dr. Abbie Maroño. I'm a behavioral scientist and the Director of Education at Social Engineer.
And an upcoming author, right? We have to talk about that sometime soon.
An upcoming multi-author. I have two books coming out. First book coming out in July. So everybody that's listening to this is required to go and buy it.
Required.
It's required.
We're not going to say that, but it's required reading for an upcoming podcast. So you're going to want to get that.
Yes.
And absolutely. The title of it, Abbie?
The title of the book is called Work in Progress.
Yes.
The Road to Empowerment, The Journey Through Shame.
So you can find it on Amazon pre-order right now. It will be coming out in July. So this podcast is out in April, but I've had the privilege of reading it, and I do suggest that you all do go run and get it now because it is quite good. Okay, on to our announcements before we get to our guest. The reason we're all here, as always, this episode is sponsored by our company, Social Engineer. We are focused on training and education. We love doing that stuff. Abbie and I just had an amazing time out in South by Southwest doing a really extensive workshop on human vulnerability. It was so good that we're actually going to start adding that to the training panel. So Abbie and I have been working on a few workshops that could benefit your company. So if you're interested in finding out about these, can run 2 hours, 3 hours, or even a half a day, reach out to us at orders@social-engineer.com, and we can talk to you about the different workshops that we're developing that can help your company with human vulnerability. I also want to invite everyone who's listening, if you're interested in social engineering, to join our Slack channel. You can find a link in the show notes, and we talk about all sorts of topics in there. Of course, it is legal and family friendly. So if that doesn't sound like you, then you shouldn't join. But if it does sound like you, we'd love to have you in there and join us to talk about all those amazing topics that we do each and every day. I also want to invite everyone to take a look at innocentlivesfoundation.org. If you're not familiar with that, it's a nonprofit that both Abbie and I are a part of. For 6.5 years, we've been helping law enforcement around the globe geolocate people who traffic children and create child abuse material. One of the second books that Abbie's talking about is a children's book that she wrote, which is going to help children learn how to be empowered and to be able to know when things are good or bad. And it's written for young kids, 3 to 6 years old. That's going to be coming out real soon. Super excited about that book because that's also really awesome. Something I didn't think we'd have for the ILF. But if you want to find out how you can support us either through joining the mission or voluntary donations, you can find that out at innocentlivesfoundation.org. And if you like the music on this podcast, it is none other than the rock and roll band Clutch. Of course, you know I love them, slowly converting Abbie into loving them. And she has to, because Neil Fallon, the lead singer, helped me start ILF 6.5 years ago. So there has to be some love for him, at least there. And last but not least, before we get to our guest, if you like the content, especially on this episode, keep giving us those comments. We really do thank you for that. Abbie and I do read all of those on YouTube and respond to them. We appreciate the positive feedback, and your ideas for guests and topics really do help us. So before you tell us the topic, Abbie, like you always do, let me introduce our amazing guest, someone who I've been wanting to have on this show for many, many years, Dr. David Matsumoto. He's a director of Humintell. It's a world-renowned expert in the field of emotion, nonverbal behavior, deception, and culture. He received his bachelor's from University of Michigan in 1981, double majoring in psychology and Japanese and receiving high honors in both. He obtained his master's in 1983 and doctoral in 1986. That sounds like you really moved fast through all of that. In psychology from the University of California at Berkeley. He's been a professor of psychology at San Francisco State University since 1989 and is the founder and director of SFSU's Culture and Emotion Research Laboratory. He's also an expert in threat assessment and management, especially in relation to behavioral indicators of operational bad actors, which is something we talk a lot about here on this podcast. He's conducted the only study to date on the cognitions, emotions, and behaviors of bad actors when they are actively engaged in an act of violence. And he has briefed the results of this work to several government agencies. He has also conducted decades of research to behavioral indicators related to deception, about the intent to commit acts of malfeasance in the future, and the behavioral indicators that emerge from this work has been briefed to countless military, intelligence, and law enforcement agencies and operations. Dr. Matsumoto, it is nothing but a pleasure to have you on the show.
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction and for asking me to be here. It's my honor to be with you and all of your audience.
Thank you. So Abbie, every month you come up with the major theme for our podcast, and sometimes we have a guest and sometimes we don't. Tell us what we're going to be discussing today.
Well, today it seems fitting, seeing as we have one of the best experts in these fields. We're going to focus largely on emotion and nonverbal communication. And I have to say, I am really, really excited to have David here with us. So I thought let's start at the beginning and let's look at the origins of human emotion, because this is something that I get a little bit frustrated with a lot of the myths that stand in this field. One in particular, there is a myth floating about that really does make me angry. The myth that emotions are not innate and they are entirely socialized. And David, you have made huge waves in this field of understanding where emotions come from. So what do you have to say about the reality of this myth?
Oh my goodness, that's a great question to start with. So, wow. Okay. So it's clear to me and most scientists, to tell you the truth. I mean, let me tangent right there and say this question has been posed to most emotion scientists, most recently, I think 10 years ago or 5 years ago. And the findings all show that the vast majority of scientists out there believe that having emotions, the capacity to have emotions, is an innate capability that humans have and are born with. And so the thought that emotions are not innate and entirely constructed is actually a minority thought or concept within the field itself, although it gets a lot of traction in news and elsewhere. So and there's a reason, there's all kinds of reasons why for that traction. And it's good to have different opinions, but it's very clear that there are clear innate biological substrates in humans from birth that allow us to have emotions and to go beyond that, to have specific types of emotions. You can look at multiple types of evidence for that. For example, you can look across the phylogenetic lines or species to various other animals and see what people would consider the evolution of the biological substrates of that across species. Yeah. And within the human species, of course, there is no variation within the species on that capability, number one. And then you can look at all the other evidence for that, including studies of congenitally blind individuals, raised in the wild, cross-cultural studies of infants and young children all around the world, et cetera, et cetera. When you consider the evidence in total, it's very clear, to tell you the truth, that there's an innate substrate for the capacity to have emotions. All humans are born with an innate ability to have them. We have this information processing system that is located in our brains that allows us to perceive and evaluate stimuli around us and within us that allow us to trigger emotions when there's something that is meaningful that is occurring to us. And so anyway, I'm taking a long way around to give you the answer, and I'm kind of babbling at this point, but there's a lot of evidence for that, for the thought that the capacity to have emotions are innate and then there's a biological substrate.
Yeah, I thought that was a perfect answer. And interestingly, I was reading a paper this morning that came out a few months ago that was looking at the freeze response. And it was looking at how when we express fear expressions, what it does to the brain of the observer is it creates a freeze in the motor cortex. Yep. So when we see other people's emotional nonverbals, the brain literally shuts down and says, you cannot move. So the idea that we're not receptive to nonverbals and emotions innately doesn't make any neurological sense when we look at the data. And the fact that when we look at things like other primates, their facial expressions are almost identical to human facial expressions.
So, Dr. Matsumoto, let me ask you a follow-up question on something you said during your answer. You did a lot of research with folks who are blind from birth that were athletes. What did that research tell you about human emotion and how it can help us understand some of the things you said.
Well, thank you for that. To set up that particular study that I think you're referencing, let me step back and say I was in the fortunate position to study Olympic judo athletes in the 2004 Athens Olympic Games. And I mean, this is a long story, but I'll try to make it short. Before this time, around 2003, and until that time, there were debates, and there's always debates in the field about whether emotions are innate or not, cross-cultural or not, whether and all kinds of questions. One major question that was occurring was, well, all the studies that demonstrate produce evidence for facial expressions of emotion, cross-culturally universal facial expressions of emotion, are occurring in the laboratory. And there's been no studies that demonstrate that they've been in the field, in the wild. And this happened at a conference. I remember this clearly because it was in July in 2004 at a conference in New York. And I was sitting on stage with the person who had an opposing position, and somebody in the audience, I couldn't have planted this question better. Somebody in the audience said, what about sports? And correctly, there were no studies on sports and immediate reactions to winning and losing in sports. And I just happened to be going to the Athens Olympic Games as an official of the International Judo Federation the following month. And so when I got into Athens, I happened to be writing in, because we're credentialed, we're writing in the official Olympic stuff. And I happened to be writing with the official photographer of the International Judo Federation, who's got all the media equipment for judo. And I asked him, his name is Bob. I said, hey, Bob, would you like to do a study with me? And he says, sure. What do I got to do? And I said, he takes a lot of action photos. And I said, just do the same thing, but keep the camera on the players after the match finishes. And so he did. And through 7 days, there's 14 categories of competition in the Olympics across 7 days. Every day he would just keep the camera on the athletes a little longer. And he was a photographer, but his cameras were shooting 8 frames a second.
Wow. Yeah.
And it's with excellent images. Anyway, every day I would get thousands of images. And essentially we boiled down to studying the first reactions of the athletes when they won or lost a medal match at the end of the day, because the medal matches are the end of the tournament for them. They're the end of 4 to 10 years of hard training, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very emotional situation. So we studied the expression. So we took the images that were occurring at that time, and I brought them back to our laboratory, and we coded the facial muscles that were occurring and the emotional expressions that the athletes were producing. And this is of the cited athletes in the Olympic Games. And what we demonstrated from that study was and by the way, here's a little aside. I got all kinds of tangents, right? But judo happens to be one of the most impacted sports in the world. In the United States, it is not as popular as it is around the world, but around the world, it is one of the most popular sports in the world. In terms of the number of sport federations in the IOC, judo ranks above soccer or football. I mean, it's just, it's an amazing sport. And in the Olympic Games, if you look at all the medals, there are more countries represented in the medals, taking medals at the Olympics than in any other sport, which means everybody else is very strong. It's just an amazing thing. Anyway, so at the Olympic Games, you can imagine that the level of competition is incredibly high. So we took the images back and we're analyzing them for whether they're producing emotional expressions. And essentially the findings show that, all the winners are generally smiling. This is immediately right on the mat. They just won. They're all smiling. The winners are smiling. Losers are either showing sadness or disgust or anger or nothing, but there's no cultural differences in these expressions. And I want to link to what I just said. There were 84 athletes we studied from 35 countries, and there are no cultural differences.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you said these were all cited folks?
Yes.
They can see? Okay.
Yes. So then, but on the podium, which is 30 minutes later, everybody smiles. So we're generating these findings. 2 weeks later, in every Olympic Games, there's a Paralympic Games. And this Paralympics rolls in, and every sport has a different disability. In judo, it happens to be blindness. And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, well, we're going to just keep on rolling. So I asked my friend Bob, hey, would you want to do the same thing for the Paralympics? He said, sure. So he did the same thing. We got the images from the Paralympic athletes. Now, some of them were acquired blindness through disease or injury or something like that, but there's a bunch of them were congenitally blind. We analyzed the difference. There's no difference in their expressions. Okay. But the medalists of the Paralympic Games in judo, which is blindness, they all showed the same thing. The winners all are smiling. The losers are all going sad, fear, disgust, something like that, contempt. And then most directly, we compared the differences between the sighted and the blind athletes. And for those people who like statistics out there, the correlation between the blind and athletes' facial activity was around 0.94.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow. And like I say, there's no way in my book, there's no way that people can learn that. Now, I go around and people want to continue to push back, say, well, maybe the babies out there in the world are having their fingers on their caregivers' faces just when their caregivers are showing anger. And thus from the tactile response, they know how to put it on. Well, for that argument to hold any water, you've got to have infants touching caregivers' faces right at the time they have each of the 6 or 7 emotions.
Yeah.
And that same thing is occurring all around the world at exactly the same time and exactly the same level of development which is impossible, right?
Yeah.
So the only logical conclusion from that line of research is that the capacity to have the facial emotions and facial expressions of emotion is biologically innate, because there's no way they could have learned that.
Yeah.
And parenthetically, my study was perhaps the latest, but not the only one. There's other 17 or 18 or 19 other studies that have demonstrated the same thing. Congenitally blind individuals, when an emotion is spontaneously elicited, produce the same facial expressions as everybody else. What blind people have a difficulty with is posing expressions. If you ask, so all of us, we can say, okay, Chris, show me what you look like when you're angry. And you'd go something like that. Yeah. And and I'd say, Abbie, show me what you look like when you're sad. And you're going to do something like that. And we can do it because we've seen it. Blind people have difficulties with that one, with posing it. They'll produce something, but it's not exactly what they do spontaneously, but we can do that. But spontaneous emotions, it's exactly the same. So I mean, this
emotions
is one of
they feel, they can do naturally, but emotions that you tell them to feel, they have a hard time envisioning how to make that happen.
It's interesting because spontaneous and feigned emotions run through different motor neuron pathways.
Sure, yes.
So having control over non-spontaneous emotions is not a skill that all of us have. A very few have such strict control over those. I don't have very good control over my non-spontaneous emotions. My face kind of says exactly how I feel all the time. And that's why we compensate things like, when we're trying to pretend we're sad, we pull down the lip corner-depressors, things like that.
Sure.
Or try and pull them down and move up the chin instead.
Yep.
So for them, they're not expressing fake emotions or they're not perception management. Those spontaneous emotions, they cannot occur, not in the same way.
Right. Other
than spontaneously, because they're completely different motor neuron pathways.
Absolutely. And by the way, we're talking about the nonverbal package. That's a reason why even blind individuals, when they're talking to somebody else who they know is blind, will still gesticulate, because gestures and the ability to gesture is part of embodied cognition that we're wired for, right? And that's why we will still have expressions and gesticulate when we're talking to somebody on the phone. Because even though we know we can't see them, we're still producing that stuff. It's part of the way we're wired to be able to do that kind of stuff. And facial expressions is one of the components of that larger nonverbal package that we've got.
Yeah, that is just fascinating. Okay, so I want to jump to this other research you did, because I think this kind of all blends in. This is so interesting. Our company and our focus is trying to help people stay safe from malicious actors. So that's what we do. Now, of course, a lot of that is non-violence. It's cyber threat. Sure. But I think your research can be very beneficial for us. So some of your research was looking at the behaviors and cognitions of people who are about to make an act of violence. Can you talk about what you found in that research, and maybe we can find some questions to correlate to our work?
Sure. I'll think about the things that I can talk about.
Okay.
But let me position our work where it is so that you have an idea, or the audience has an idea of what we're talking about. So there's actually a lot of great research out there in the last 20 years about behavioral indicators of individuals being indoctrinated, radicalized, whatever the ideology is, and how they come along a pipeline and how they start to ramp up to violence. And so there's a lot of good research out there. So for example, a person might start looking differently. They might have more facial hair, or they might dress differently, or they might do, different. These are all behaviors, right? Mm-hmm. They may start closing their thinking. It's called cognitive complexity, right? When they lose cognitive complexity about the issues that they're passionate about, then they may be ramping up to violence, because instead of thinking things more in complex ways, people start thinking good and bad, right or wrong, live or die, et cetera, et cetera. But so one can think of a line along which a person is going towards committing an act of violence, which includes, a person can go and purchase weapons or purchase various things that they need. They may do some surveillance. They may think of recon. They may think of their escape plan if they planned on living afterwards. And again, there's a whole bunch of research on that. My work is a little different in this area. My work has been focused on, they've done the planning, they've been indoctrinated, they're at the extreme, they decided to go and commit an act of violence. Now, and maybe they rehearsed it. Now they're moving into the area of operation, whatever that is. It could be an airport, it could be a ballpark, it could be a music arena, whatever that is. Now they're there, and they're along the way to do the act. What do they look like then? Because at that point, that's different than I went out and rented a car. I went out and bought some fuel. I went and bought a ton of fertilizer. Those are different kinds of cues. Yeah. So where I've focused on is in the immediate, and most of the stuff that I've been working on is most relevant for people at checkpoints, for example, or people who are in immediate harm's way, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I'm filtering as I'm talking here, because there's stuff that I can talk about and stuff like I should not talk about. But, people look different. There's different ways in which people look different. The one thing I want to say about that is that at that point, it doesn't matter the ideology or any of that stuff. There are people on a mission, committing an act of violence. They're on operation. And so they look like any other person on an operation. It doesn't matter what the ideology is. Now, there are specific behavioral traits associated with different, let's say, levels of training or levels of indoctrination and whatnot. And so that I kind of don't want to get into. But they are individual. They're humans trying to commit an act of violence. And as you know, and probably your audience knows, committing an act of violence to another human is something that we're not born with. And even military have to go out and train to overcome that instinct, right? And so because of those human cognitive factors, you'll see different kinds of behavioral indicators. And that's the kind of stuff that we identified. I can't talk about one in particular. I not in terms of describing it, but there was one in particular where we were able to find, or isolate a particular expression, two different types of expressions of individuals who are on the way to commit an act of violence. They happen to be, the expressions are different depending upon when they are, whether it's premeditated or it's unplanned, but people just reactive. And these are the expressions of the people before they've committed the act of violence. And so we conducted a number of studies about them, which is why I can talk about it, and then published them, which is why I can talk about this set. And so we've isolated the two expressions about that. And, we include that in our training and briefing of those individuals who are in harm's way. And we actually developed some training tools around that as well. But that one is published research, so I can talk a little about that a little bit more.
You know, it'd be fascinating is seeing if people who are about to commit violence from a cyber threat, if they would have the same expressions. Because I would imagine whether you're going to kill people or whether you're going to ruin a whole person's life, you know, take their life savings, there has to be a similar emotional pattern.
Well, when it's virtual, there's an emotional buffer.
Yeah.
We kind of dehumanize the target. So the emotional responses are very different because we feel such heightened emotion because they're human and we're going to hurt them. When we're behind a screen, we really have this dehumanization effect. So the emotional intensity is much lower.
Yep.
But David, just on what you were saying, I find the threat detection so fascinating because I've done my own research in the crime script analysis of radicalization of extremists, both violent, non-violent. So we looked at the pre-event behaviors.
Sure.
And I could never figure out the right kind of study to study the nonverbal behaviors because there's always that issue. I worked with motion capture and I like the automated nonverbal analysis because it's cleaner, you get very robust data, but it's in a laboratory.
Yeah.
And non-laboratory research in those kinds of fields, it's very difficult to get the data.
Sure.
How did you get that kind of data? And how do I get that kind of data?
Well, okay. So this is very interesting. There's no one source of data that I think will do the trick. And so my approach and our approach in the company was to triangulate various sources of data to see what comes out from the triangulation process. And so the various sources of data we had, it did include some experiments. So we actually had some experiments where a person is, for example, I'm filtering because I want to make sure I can talk about these things. This is in a laboratory now at a university. We did this at several universities with different collaborators where an individual comes in, they've been recruited, they're members of an ideologically motivated group. Okay. There's a checkpoint set up in the laboratory. I mean, large laboratories where there's actual checkpoints set up and there's a guard there in a military uniform carrying an M4, of course, an inert M4. And an individual who's a member of an ideologically motivated group comes in. They're told that they can do something against the group that they hate, but they got to get through the checkpoint. They're all carrying an inert Beretta. So everybody's carrying a weapon. Yeah. And everybody's carrying a piece of paper. But for half of them, the paper says this person is like a legal permit. And for the other half, it was just a piece of paper. And so there's no differences in the weightage that they're carrying. And this is an important point because there have been studies that have shown that people carrying a weapon have different gait than people that don't carry a weapon. But that's because of the load, not the weapon, right? So in what we did was everybody's carrying a weapon, and everybody's carrying a piece of paper. So there's no differences in the weight. It's just that some people have the legal paper and some people don't. They're walking up to the checkpoint. And so we're studying everything in their kinematics, their gait and whatnot. They get to checkpoint. The guard asks gruff questions. They're standing there reacting to this and they're allowed to go through, etc. And so we study everything that they're doing from the walk up to the way they walk to the way they answer the questions to the way they hold their body, et cetera, et cetera. And actually this interesting, right? Because there's differences in the gait, even though there's no differences between the people who are carrying legally versus those who are not, even though there's no differences in the weight. So it's all a psychological process. So back to your question. So we have studies like that where we did that in the laboratory. And then part of the triangulation was where we went and interviewed former bad actors who are, they exist, right? Former bad actors who kind of decided to change their ways. Now they're helping us to go against whatever their previous way was. So they're available to us. And so I went and interviewed these people and said, okay, tell me what it was like when you were hitting curbside and you're walking to that target. What were you thinking? What were you doing? Do you remember doing anything? Do you remember saying anything? So that's one thing, because now I'm in people's heads. getting cognitions and self-reports of behavior, right? And then we interviewed also observers of those individuals who are on a mission, right? And then we also interviewed interrogators of bad actors who have knowledge about what the cognitions and emotions and thus their self-reported behaviors were of the bad actors, not through the indoctrination process, but through when they're hitting AO, area of operation, conducting the op. And so we have those, and then we have whatever limited video sources that we could get of actual operators going through and committing an act of violence. So it's like, I think I just mentioned 4 or 5 different types of sources of evidence. We analyzed all of those. Each of them have different things, but when they come out with some consistent things, then we start thinking, okay, there's some consistency in this, and this. And that's how we try to triangulate that information.
And your study where they had the different pieces of paper, did you record it via automated methods like different motion capture, or was it video and then analyzed afterwards?
It was both. We had motion capture, kinematic motion capture. They've got sensors all over their body, plus regular video. And then there's a whole bunch of kinematics that were analyzed, extracted from the kinematics, along with the usual nonverbal stuff.
Yeah.
Did you find that there was a lack of empathy in those who were committed and premeditated to commit violence?
I did not, because we never looked at that. We were just interested in, and I am to be interested pretty solely in the behavior, you know, and not so much what's in their heads. Now, with the bad actors, it's very interesting because a lot of them are empathetic. A lot of them think they're empathetic, and then once they hit AO, you know, there's people, they hit an area of operations where I'm going to use an airport as an example, but that's just a hypothetical example. Let's say people are hitting an airport and they're walking toward the target area, which may be a checkpoint, right? And there are people who hit the area and walk through the checkpoint and then decide to change targets because they see people there. And like I said earlier, people have to overcome our innate response not to hurt others. So people have changed targets. People have gone back and forth, up and down, right and right. They turn around. People do a lot of different things. Once you're in context, right? Yeah. People do a lot of different things when they see a uniformed officer. People do a lot of different things when people come up and talk to them, right? Hey, buddy, what time is it? You know, things like that. So, it's very interesting how all of this works in context.
I still would think, despite what was said before about being behind a screen, there's a lot of cyber attacks that involve getting on the phone. I mean, one of the things that are really common right now is something in this country, at least, is called a kidnapping scam. So bad actors will spoof, your daughter's number, call you and say they have her, and if you don't give money right away, you can't even hang up the phone. You have to transfer it. We're going to hurt her, and that level of maliciousness just seems like I can't imagine it, right? I can't imagine as a parent, I can't imagine doing that to someone. Sure. And the way it would leave them feeling even after when they've realized, oh, my child wasn't in danger. Yeah. But, that fear, it would be interesting to study that, that type of attack and to see if there's any indicators, because it just seems to be getting worse and worse all the time, in the cyber world, at least. Like every day there's another breach or another threat actor's thinking of something even worse now with deep fakes and stuff. It's just getting worse and worse, right? Well, I think you raise an interesting empirical question, right? As to whether the indicators of those individuals at the time that they're committing the act, whether they look like another person doing a face-to-face act of violence. So I don't know the answer to that question. I would guess it's different. I do agree that there's some degree of distancing because it's virtual, because it's cyber, right? Whereas when you're right in front of somebody and you're going to do something to that person, that's pretty visceral.
And there's no emotional contagion either, because we catch each other's emotions. So when you're in front of someone and they're showing a fear response, even if you do lack empathy, it's the brain's natural capacity to react to their fear. When they're behind a phone, you can hear it for sure, but it doesn't have quite the same effect because it's the seeing of the emotional behavior that has that neural effect. Right. So Yeah, I would agree with you, David, that there would be an effect, but I think that it would be much, much lower.
Sure.
I think if you
Very
looked at it
different.
on a scale, it would be, really towards the bottom end because of that dehumanization
Sure.
and that removal of emotional body
Yeah,
language.
it's the and the anonymity of it, right? Because once people,
Yeah.
that's why people in theaters can yell, scream, cry, and do all kinds of things because it's dark. And that's the same thing with the internet, right?
That's a
It's
really good
anonymous,
point.
So when things are anonymous or we think we're anonymous, the rules about how we express things are different.
Boy, that is so true on the internet nowadays, isn't it?
Oh yeah.
I mean, with bullying and people say horrific things to each other when it's over a screen.
Yep.
Yeah. So when you take the research that you did and trying to understand the behaviors of people who are about to commit violence, and then you take the research that you did completely opposite, right? Trying to understand the behaviors of people who are winning and losing. Was there any way that you correlated those two things to be able to say, like, we have something new, we learned something by combining those pieces of research?
Well, here's the way I take this body of work. It shows how it shows human nature. And whether it's expressing emotions at an Olympic Games or expressing ourselves through acts of violence, it's all part of human nature. And to tell you the truth, I don't think whether you're, an ISIS fighter or a Tamil Tiger or a white supremacist or an Antifa person, when you're there in the moment committing an act of violence or about to, you kind of look the same, You're humans. When you're winning a match or losing a medal in the Olympic Games, whether you're sighted or not, you're a human and you look the same. So, so that's the way I kind of see my and other bodies of work, that it demonstrates the varieties of our human response, but the varieties of our responses, but not varieties across cultures or genetics or races. And, at some point we're all human doing human things. And that's the way I've kind of understood my work on these various topics.
And you have a new book coming out, I believe.
Yeah, we recently published the 7th edition of Culture and Psychology. It's a textbook. It's an academic textbook. That's pretty well used around the world. I'm very happy about that. And it's kind of summarizes not only about emotion and expressions and nonverbal behaviors, but all kinds of different kinds of cultural similarities and differences around the world. And I tell you, I mean, related to, or just the topic we were just talking about, when you look at cognitions and behaviors and things, there's so many similarities around the world for all of us. We like to make a big deal out of the differences, but statistically speaking, the differences across cultures is minute compared to the differences among individuals.
Yeah, and it must be so rewarding to see those books in university classrooms, right? Because it's all about the learning. It's all about that creation of new science and new scientists. So it must be so rewarding to see those helping create new scientists.
Well, I have two thoughts about that. I remember when I was a young academic, maybe 5 years past my PhD, thinking and looking back at my previous articles, because I was fortunate to write articles when I was a graduate student, looking back at those articles thinking, what poor writing. I don't believe I actually wrote that stuff, and thinking to myself, I wonder if one day I'm going to be able to write a book. And kind of being lost in not lost, but just wondering about the rigmarole of doing the research and all that kind of stuff. And of course, 30 years pass and here I am. I've got some, but at this point, yes, it's very satisfying to put things together and hopefully that they're meaningful for others. Here's another tangent, right? I mean, one of these ways I think about what we do as academics is about 20 or 25 years ago, I was invited to give a talk at some organization. I don't even remember what the organization was. And I walked into the organization's library and there was one of my books. And they were telling me how they use that as a basis for some of their training. And I thought, oh my goodness, what we write is actually used to intervene in people's lives. Boy, we got to get that right. Whether it's a therapist or a consultant, et cetera, et cetera. And it was kind of an epiphany for me, right? Because you can't just write things and have it go on a library in psychology because it's going to be it may be used someplace.
Yeah.
So at this point in my
burden.
Yeah, when you think about it like that, it's a public. I think a lot of scholars look at publication as the game that we got to play to get along in our careers. But I think there is a large obligation for all of this. Coming to this part of my life, I recently retired from San Francisco State University last year. Even though I still am back to teach a couple classes. I run my company, which you mentioned earlier, Humintell, and I'm at the point where I want to use psychological knowledge to help others, like what you guys do, right? I think that's a good thing for academics, post-academics, or those who can translate academics to do, because another article, another book in the long haul, that what does that really mean? In all truth, I mean, my children have no idea what I do and what I write and what I do, and that's correct. They just want me to be dad.
Yeah.
In the big picture of the world, I started thinking, what's really important, right? Is it another paper? Is it another book? At my point, for others, yes, that's clear. It's the answer. For me, at this point in my career, that's not the answer. The answer is finding ways in which I can translate psychological science to be useful for people in certain fields to be better at whatever they're doing. And so that's what I'm doing. Right?
I agree with that. I don't think my family has read any of the books I've written. I don't, not even one of them. They might have read the first forward or something, and that's it, right?
Well, I think the only thing that my family looks for is whether their name is in the dedication or something.
That's it. That's what my daughter does. She scans it for her name, and then that's it. If it's not in there, why didn't you mention me, Dad? Like kind of thing.
But that's perfectly okay. They don't need us to be an author or a scholar. They need us to be mom and dad. Right?
What you were saying about your mission now is the reason why we brought someone like Dr. Abbie onto our staff, because I had a really interesting experience with a business owner where we had done this test, the human audit test, and it was really devastating for them. And I don't mean in a psychological way, just like showed a lot of vulnerability. And they said, "But what do we do to fix it?" And I didn't really have an answer. It was just like more testing.
Sure.
And he said something to me that kind of profoundly affected me. He said, if I went to my mechanic and he told me that this sound was the brakes, and I said, "Great, fix it." And he said, "I can't fix it. I'd never go back to that mechanic again."
Right.
And I'm like, okay, that's a fair point.
Absolutely.
So I'm like, we need science. We need science to fix it, because we're talking about human vulnerability and human behavior, and we can't fix it just by slapping them in the face. So we decided we needed to bring someone on to help us build educational resources that use psychology and science to affect that change in people. So it's wonderful to hear you say, now all these years, these 30 plus years or whatever you have in research, you want to take this now and apply it to making the world safer and better. We need more of that. We really do.
Yeah. And not to talk bad or look down on any others who choose other ways. This happens to be my way. I mean, I still write, I still do research and whatnot. But I spend a lot of time trying to understand the field and trying to understand behavioral science so I can tell a police officer how we can conduct interrogations better, or how we can tell somebody else how to do this thing better, So, anyway, that's what I'm trying to do. And that's where my life is at this point.
Go ahead, Abbie, sorry.
Once an academic, always an academic at heart. And I feel very lucky to be able to be an academic in the private sector. And I have to say, as a young scientist, I've used so much of your material to get myself to the point that I am. When I was doing my PhD, and my PhD was focused in information elicitation and nonverbal communication, and I used motion capture, I studied so much of your work. And that really helped me along the way. And your work and work like researchers like you fueled my passion and my love, which is what made me want to do the same thing, to translate that to lay people. So, personally for me, thank you for all the work that you've done in this field. It's made not just footprints, but huge strides for our understanding of nonverbal communication.
Well, you're very kind, and I'm touched to be able that my work has helped others, spur others on. But it's kind of interesting, right? Because my family that I was brought up in, nobody thought there's no academics, and people didn't think, I come from Hawaii, and I'm a third generation Japanese, so nobody thought anybody should be a psychologist either, So And my parents were pretty blue collar, and so if I were not an academic, I mean, being an academic is such a wonderful gig, right? But if I weren't, I'd probably be a PE teacher, to tell you the truth.
You'd be a judo instructor, right?
Well, I am a judo instructor, but
yeah,
I do PE and judo all day long, or something like that,
So, Dr. Matsumoto, if people want to find out more about what you're doing next or your research, what's the best place for them to connect with you and your work?
Well, thank you for that. The best place to connect with me at this point is at my company's website. It's www.humintell.com. And you can always send us an email at info@humintell.com, or there's a contact form, I think, out there. There's various social media stuff that I'm really bad at. So you can always find us out there. But yeah, come and take a look and see how we try to translate psychological science into some practical things for people.
And for everyone listening, we'll put the link in the show notes so you don't have to remember that if you're jogging or listening to this while you're driving. So we'll have all that in there so they can find you. I honestly can't thank you enough, Dr. Matsumoto, for coming on the show. This was a fascinating conversation. I just looked at the time, and we normally try to only take 30, 35 minutes of the guest time. We were going 50 minutes, but I was so entrenched in what you were saying that we could probably talk for another hour. So thank you so much for coming on.
It is my honor and pleasure to have been here with you and your audience. I hope something that we talked about, that people can find some meaning in something that we've talked about there.
I know they will. Hey, Abbie, remind us, what is our topic for next month when we come back to the Doctor is In series?
I think our topic next month is overworking.
Why do you got to pick ones that make me feel like you're talking about me?
I'm outing everyone in our company.
I mean,
but we're going to talk about the psychology and the psychological effects of overwork.
Okay, so it's going to be another lay on the couch and have a confessional session for Abbie and I.
We're basically going to have a therapy session. But
that's it.
Talk about the research.
Come back next month, everyone. Thank you for joining us this month when Abbie and I will be in personal therapy with 40,000 of you watching. So until then, please stay safe and stay secure. See you.